Thanks. Are we good? Awesome. Good afternoon. My name is John Askew, and today I am presenting on the evolution of CNC. This is not the evolution of cookies and cream, because, I mean, honestly, where do you go from here? It's the ice cream of the future, but we have it today. This is not the evolution of Coheed and Cambria, although they've got a number of albums that progress through the years in interesting ways. I know we're talking about command and control today, although I don't know what it has to do with nuclear missiles, but this was the best picture I could find. Like I said, my name is John Askew. I'm not the trance DJ from the UK, although I am somewhat of a fan. I'm just a guy from right here in Kentucky. Been doing penetration testing and red teaming stuff for going on 12 years now. I still consider myself a beginner. The more I learn, the more I realize I don't know hardly anything, so I'm always trying to learn more. I also enjoy writing software, and that's part of why I'm here today, some stuff that I've played around with. And a quick disclaimer, these are my statements, not positions or views of any clients or employers. So I'm really honored to be speaking here today in front of you all. This is a really big room. I'd like to give you a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about for the next 45 minutes. I'm going to break it into 3 different parts. First, we're going to do a brief history of command and control. And it's not really a chronological history. It's more, I'll be kind of cherry picking some different command and control methods and talking about how capabilities change and evolve between them from the past through what do we use today most commonly, and then looking towards the future, what things are we going to be seeing from command and control going forward. Second, with that forward-thinking view, how can we increase red team capabilities? We're going to talk a little bit about capabilities and maturity and hierarchy of needs, and what are the ways that we can advance these capabilities into the future. And then lastly, from a blue team perspective, I'm not very much of a blue teamer, but I want to talk about how we mature our detection and response in kind with these new potential capabilities. How do we detect those and respond to them? And I think there are a few interesting things from some research that'll potentially be useful to that effect. So, to start off, let's go over just a brief definition of command and control, what we're talking about today. The MITRE ATT&CK framework gives a really good working definition here. It's a tactic, which and I'm sure you've heard about MITRE ATT&CK framework this weekend from multiple other talks, but you've got a hierarchy of tactics, techniques, and procedures or processes, and this is a tactic, so a high-level thing, that represents how adversaries communicate with systems under their control within a target network. So basically, when an attacker gains access to a host or system, how do they retain control of that host remotely over a given time period? There's other related components. How do you get that payload on the system? Do you use stagers? How do you persist your control? How do you make sure that malware continues to run? And then post-exploit modules, all the fun stuff that you can do while you have access. We're not really going to talk much about those. I'm going to try to focus just on the communication channel aspect, because that's more than enough to cover an hour's time. A few other concepts I want to cover before we dive in. Capability is something I'm going to repeatedly say. Basically, the ability to perform or achieve certain actions or outcomes. In offensive security, we can use this to describe the extent of what an adversarial threat actor can achieve during an attack. And specific to command and control, I think we'll be talking about capabilities along several different axes or aspects, like reliability, security, concealability. On the flip side, you've got this idea of constraints. So attackers and defenders both operate under a number of constraints, which are limits that are placed on those capabilities. These can be general, that that apply to, your blue team as a whole or your red team as a whole. How much time, resources, personnel do you have to be able to do research and to be able to develop things? More specifically, we've got situational constraints, like attack surface. In a particular environment that you're attacking, what does the attack surface look like? What are the firewall rules and the endpoint controls and all these other things that are going to influence your decision on what command and control method to use and what will work in those situations. And also situational awareness, being aware of that environment, of what's going on, and knowing what is being looked for. Those kind of things are also going to affect how you decide to do command and control. And so you got capabilities and constraints that are kind of playing against each other. So let's jump into a brief history of command and control. And this is going to be more like a narrative than actual history. But once upon a time, there's a buffer overflow in Bob's network server. I guess it was the 90s, and it was cool to not check your bounds in memory. So we got a vulnerability. Alice finds this vulnerability. She wants to exploit it. But she didn't want to commit to a specific payload up front. She liked the ability to kind of retain control and decide what she wants to do over a period of time. Maybe send some commands, receive a response, and then decide, from there, make some new decisions on what to do. So Alice made a bind shell. So I guess the bind shell is probably one of the simplest types of command and control you can think of, right? You got malicious software that opens up a port on your target system, and then your attacker can connect directly to it and get a shell. You can send commands, you get responses back, and life is good. You can make that target do your bidding. So that's great. Now we have something we didn't have before. We've increased our reliability. We've also increased our agility. We got some flexibility to send a command, receive a response, and then based on what that response is, we can make other decisions of different commands to send. Maybe we've decreased security a little bit by opening a port on a target network that someone else can connect to, but we'll ignore that for the time being. But there's some problems with the bind shell too. It's definitely not the end all of command and control, right? There's situations that this is just not going to work for us. In particular, you've got firewall rules. Anybody that's ever done an external penetration test or a red teaming exercise where you're trying to gain a foothold on an internal network, you're probably going to do some kind of phishing. You're probably going to try to exploit endpoints which are inside of a corporate network, inside of a perimeter firewall. And those firewalls have ingress rules and NAT and all this other stuff that prevents you from going from the internet directly into their network. So bind shell is no-go for something like phishing, right? But that's okay, because now we have the reverse shell, which is a reverse connection. Am I reading that right? Okay. That's the joke that everybody laughs at. Yep. So a reverse shell is almost the exact same thing as a bind shell, except the connection starts in reverse. Instead of opening up that port, the target is going to connect back to the attacker, and then at that point, the connection's established. You can shuffle those bytes back and forth, send commands, get responses. Life is good. You can make the target do your bidding. So we've increased our capabilities, right? Yay, weak egress filtering, because this is going to work in a lot more scenarios, because egress filtering in corporate environments is generally a lot weaker than ingress filtering. There's usually some way out of environment, or at least it's a lot easier to get out than it is to get in. So we've increased our reliability. It's working in a lot more situations that are useful to us. And we've maybe slightly increased security and concealability and some other things as well. But mainly, we've got that increased reliability, which is cool. So reverse shell is great. We can all go home, right? Now there's still some constraints here, because egress filtering does exist, so you might have to pick the right port to go out. Maybe they blocked all ports from the particular host you want to compromise, so it can't just get out at all. And this is not a particularly stealthy method, right? It's just a raw, probably TCP connection between two IP addresses that's just shuffling bytes back and forth that have commands and command responses in them. Maybe you've got some encryption, but it's not something that's necessarily going to blend in well with under a high amount of scrutiny. So Oh, and there's one other thing, potential attribution. So you got this payload that's connecting back to an IP address on the internet. Whenever that gets detected, that IP address is going to be associated with this campaign, and so you can start associating that with other things, and it's more information for an investigation to use. So what's the next thing after reverse shells? Well, IRC channels. Everybody loves IRC channels, right? So this was actually something that was really popular for botnets in the early 2000s. There may still be some that use IRC. I don't know. For those of you who don't know what IRC is, it's Internet Relay Chat. It's what Slack was like 10 years ago. So if you know what Slack is, it's like that, but like at a terminal, like with the dark background. Yeah. So people started using IRC channels to send their command and control messages. And this is nice for a number of reasons. But the way it works is your targets join an IRC server, they connect to an IRC server, they join a channel, and they listen for commands. And your attacker connects to that same channel, types the commands out, and those get broadcast to all of your targets, which then can execute the commands. So it's a little bit more sophisticated than a reverse shell for a number of reasons. So first of all, we have moved from a raw network layer up to a protocol layer. And we're using the IRC protocol, not just raw TCP. So there's some increased reliability with that because protocols are more likely to be allowed. If they're in use in your target environment, then a protocol may be more likely to be allowed to connect out to the internet. We've also increased our concealability, because presuming that there's other IRC traffic on your network, then this can potentially blend in, right? So this is great. We've got an IRC shell, right? IRC command and control method. But there are some problems as well. Namely, in 2018, that's the year it is, right? 2018, I don't think many people are actually using IRC. Is anyone using IRC? There's a few. But is anybody's work using IRC for business purposes? Not a lot. So this is likely to stand out in a lot of places that we would want to use it, potentially. It's likely to be blocked and detected. Not only for the fact that it's unusual, but also for the fact that for a decade or more, we had lots of botnets using this. So we got a lot of scrutiny. But I like this idea of tunneling through protocols, right? So are there other protocols that we can tunnel through? Sure, we can do just about anything, right? You got ICMP, which you can tunnel through, but it's kind of slow and kludgy. You can send stuff through SMTP, but email's kind of complicated. I don't really want to get into that can of worms. We can just use raw UDP. There we go. Everybody's favorite UDP joke. I'd tell you, but you might not get it, and I wouldn't care if you did. But there is one, or actually two, but one protocol in particular that turns out to work really well, and that's DNS. So, and we're here in the modern age now. This is stuff that everybody's using. DNS tunneling works well for command and control for a number of reasons. The two biggest I can think of is one, it's very ubiquitous. You can't have the internet without DNS. You have to be able to resolve names to IP addresses to get anywhere. So DNS is necessary, and it's going to be on every network. It's also got its own built-in routing, right? DNS is recursive, so you make a query. You don't have to query your attacker server. You can query your local DNS server, and then it will recurse to another one, to another one, to another one, and it'll eventually get back to your malicious DNS server through the magic of DNS. It's built right into the protocol, which is great. So we've got high reliability because those two reasons that I just stated, and also concealment because DNS is everywhere, right? So great. We can all go home? No, because actually it turns out if you're looking for DNS, if you're doing DNS inspection, it's fairly detectable. I mean, there's ways to hide it, but you know, in most cases it tends to be obvious when you're using DNS for command and control, unless you're being very, very careful about it. So in fact, it does serve a use for, well, I won't get into that yet. Let's move on to one other protocol and wrap things up on the history. HTTP is the other, well, probably the most popular method for command and control, not least of which because it's the most common protocol on the internet. And its use in command and control tends to be mostly building a custom HTTP server and a client, and then doing some type of polling or beaconing out to that server. So you build your HTTP request payload and you encode your commands into URLs or headers or parameters. You send it, and you do the same thing in the HTTP response. You encode those command and control commands within that protocol, that HTTP protocol. And you can even get you can get a lot of flexibility with this. There's a thing that's commonly referred to as malleable C2 profiles, where you can tweak all those parameters, right? You can say, I want to make the URL look a certain way, and I want to make the headers look a certain way, and I want to make the post parameters look a certain way, and make it behave like this in such a manner to simulate particular websites or things like that. So we've got a high reliability and concealability just from the fact that HTTP is used everywhere, and you've got a lot of that flexibility with malleable profiles. You've also got this idea of resilience where we've gone from a stateful, like a synchronous connection, like a TCP connection or something like that, to something that's stateless. You've got a request and response, and then you can wait 5 seconds and do another request and response, or you can wait an hour, or you can wait a day or whatever, but you don't have to have a constant connection. And you've also got other infrastructure like proxying that helps make it more resilient to failure. So these are all good things to have in a command and control protocol, and help us out a lot. There's still some constraints. In particular, if you're setting up a HTTP command and control server, you're going to put it on some IP or domain or at some URL, and once it's discovered, that thing is going to allow you to tie it back to other things. There's that, but then I want to talk about this other concept that many of you may be familiar with, domain fronting, which is not a command and control method per se, but it can be used effectively with HTTP to mask your actual destination and avoid blocking, because when you do this, and I don't really have time to go into the technical details of how this works, but connections go to an actual cloud load balancer or something like that, so it looks like it's actually going to Amazon or Google or somewhere, and then on the back end it gets routed to your actual malicious command and control server. And this used to be possible with Google and Amazon CloudFront, but both of them earlier this year supposedly fixed that issue. It may still be possible to do with Microsoft's network, and there's lists on GitHub of potential domain fronting domains that you can test out. So this is still a legitimate way to mask your command and control traffic, but definitely took a hit by Google and Amazon eliminating it. So you could get really, really close to looking like actual legitimate traffic with HTTP and domain fronting and some of these profiling things, but there's nothing quite as good as the real thing, right? So the last thing I want to talk about is apps and third-party services. So we've seen a lot of, more recently, a lot of command and control traffic utilizing specific applications or third-party services. We've seen one-off tools and POCs that have been created for specific services. We've seen some tools add external command and control plugin capabilities where you can write a plugin to use a specific method or service and add it in. And there's definitely been use by real-world threats. So this is something where by going from looking like, Google Cloud Platform traffic to being actual Google Cloud Platform traffic increases our concealment and also increases our reliability. Some constraints there, situational awareness. So if you're going to use something like this, you need to be aware of what your target is using, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. And there's probably some other constraints with it as well, but this is kind of where I want to focus a little bit on the future of command and control, and how we'll be using more of these third-party channels. So I'd say it's likely that all these methods will continue to work in some cases, particularly opportunistic attacks. And in fact, if a bind shell or reverse shell is going to work for you in a particular situation, then you might as well use that instead of doing something more advanced, given your situation and your constraints you're operating under. Hopefully, we're going to see mature organizations continue to improve their capabilities for detecting and preventing a lot of these methods. And there's tooling out there that exists up to a certain level, I believe. But on the red team side, if we want to be able to succeed against these mature organizations, we're going to need to blend more and more into that legitimate traffic as much as possible. And that's going to include those third-party channels. So the next thing I want to talk about is how we take this and we start to increase those capabilities. So some of you may be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the idea of a person being having a number of needs, and they have to be met in a certain order, like the foundational ones before you move up the pyramid. So there's no point in worrying about a seam if you can't eat today, right? And then there's also this, which has nothing at all to do, I think, with the hierarchy of needs, but I like Parks and Rec. But I think it'd be useful to talk about command and control from a red team perspective in a hierarchy of needs. So you've got these different capabilities, or different aspects of capabilities that I've been talking about, like reliability and security. And I think those at the bottom, reliability and security, are probably the most foundational of these. You've got to have something that works, that accomplishes your goal. And then, well, here, let me just jump into one at a time. We need something that's reliable, right? We need something that can deliver our messages, our command and control messages. We need something that works, not just in the lab, but out in the field. And we need, at the same time, something that's going to be secure. Because if we're introducing vulnerabilities into a client's network as part of a penetration test or a red team engagement, then that's a huge problem, right? We don't want to make them less secure, we want to make them more secure. So security is important. And so thinking about the needs for a command and control framework, we got to think about encryption and authentication. So in particular, TLS is not enough today. Not every single organization out there is doing man-in-the-middle inspection of TLS, but enough are that it should just be assumed. And we should make this security built in and as simple and foot gun free as possible, because we don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot. Which I don't know what a foot gun would actually look like. I'm thinking. Okay, so we also need, moving up that pyramid from reliability and security. Next thing I had in here was concealment. We want to be able to avoid detection for at least some minimum period of time against some level of detection capabilities, right? It's gotta work long enough for us to get the job done. If they figure it out, 2 weeks later or 6 months later, it may not be as big of a deal, but we need it to at least conceal ourselves long enough to achieve our goal. Beyond that, we want resilience. We want something that's going to operate and continue to operate in the face of unexpected outages. So I'm sure no one's ever had a shell just disappear for no reason in the middle of an engagement, right? If we can build redundancy in, then that can help us out there. And then on top of that is agility. We want to be able to adapt. We want to have flexibility to adapt to new and unexpected needs, because unexpected things happen in pretty much every engagement. And not only be able to adapt, but be able to adapt quickly. So if we can build tools and frameworks that allow us to do that easily, then we're going to be that much better off. And then you got features at the top, which are like icing on the cake, I guess. Like, remember the old food pyramid? You had like sugar at the very top. That's what that is. So, yeah, resilience. I'm going to repeat myself here. Sorry, slides got a little bit out of order. Expect messages to be lost and still operate. Expect some network traffic to be blocked or modified and still operate. And try to learn from other software engineering disciplines. Like there's a lot of stuff out there on message passing and on consensus and things like that. We don't have to get too advanced, but there's some things we can pick up there and apply to our tools. Yeah, agility in particular, it'd be nice if we can plug in new transport mechanisms during engagements. So we realize that a target is using a particular service, and we can adapt that service to our needs in the middle of an engagement. That'd be nice. Okay, so I started writing some code. I called this thing Hyperwave for whatever reason. It's a framework for decentralized messaging over the internet. Basically, message passing that can be used as part of a command and control framework. And the code will be posted there on Bitbucket, hopefully later today or tomorrow. I've tried to, thinking about these needs, I tried to think about how you would build something that would meet a lot of these needs. And this is in no way a completed concept, but some things that I tried to lead with were using some functional programming principles where you build larger things from small pieces, kind of like Legos, building a big Lego thing, because it gives you a lot of flexibility. You can rearrange those Legos. Wanted to do something that's decentralized and have first-class routing built in, because and move a little bit away from a client-server model, because you could still model a client-server with a decentralized network, but it gives you more of that flexibility. And I wanted to have pluggable transports so that you can change things out, use different types of channels within the same framework. Again, for that flexibility and adaptability. So I'll just go over a few things about the architecture. At a high level, there's a concept of an address, which is a unique identifier, kind of like an IP address. Currently, it's represented as a UUID4 value. But every peer in the network has a unique address. You can't have a message passing framework without messages, right? So this is this atomic element of communication from one peer to another. And the message is basically a combination of a header and a body. The header is that metadata that the framework uses, and then the body is whatever the implementation decides to use. So you can make that whatever you want. Then there's this concept of an envelope, which is the encrypted message plus the minimum amount of metadata that you need to handle and deliver that message within the framework. Right now, that metadata includes a destination address, which allows you to relay and deliver, ultimately, the messages, and some type of identifier for each individual message that allows you to track those. And then a transport, which is the mechanism for asynchronously sending and receiving those envelopes. So these are, generally speaking, services that can be used and be used for ad hoc message queuing. And this is kind of where that 99-ish number comes in from the very beginning of the talk, the title. Now don't get too excited, because not all these things are necessarily available right now for use, but the general concept is you can take a lot of these different services and plug them in interchangeably and still get your messages delivered. And you'll take an envelope and be able to embed it inside a base64 text body or a JPEG file or an MP3 or other different types of formats that these different services can natively utilize. And going down this route, I found there's a few interesting benefits to looking at things in this way. So one example here is transitivity. So say you build this hyperwave network, you've got 3 peers. None of them can connect directly to each other. Let's just say peer 1 is our command and control server, and peer 2 is like a workstation on a target network that can get out to the internet and can, in fact, reach Dropbox. So you can use this framework to send messages through Dropbox to peer number 2. So now they can communicate. And then peer 3 is actually blocked completely from the internet, but they both peer 2 and peer 3 have access to a CIFS file share. So we can use that to relay messages between 2 and 3. And then by transitivity, which is just, I guess, a pretentious way of saying routing, you can send messages between peer 1 and peer 3. And I'm actually going to show a demo of this specific example in a second. Example number 2 is redundancy. So another thing we kind of get for free by approaching things from this way is you can have redundancy. So we've got peer 1 and peer 2, and they can both connect to S3 bucket of some sort, and they can both connect to Google Drive. So we can have them use both methods to relay messages back and forth. And then if one goes down, then you can have failover through the other one, which is something that would be useful in an engagement, right? You always want to have multiple ways so you're not out of luck if one goes down. So I was going to try to do a live demo, but I have no internet access. So I did make a video, and unfortunately it seems like the live demo is not as common as it used to be. I kind of missed that. But here's a thing I recorded this morning when I did have internet access. And to preface this, so there's the framework, and then I wrote a little implementation of an implant and like a server, so that I could actually do something with it. So in this situation, I've got 2 implants running on Windows machines that can both reach a file share, like in that first example, and then I've got one running here on my Mac that can hit Dropbox. And so let me just play this. So what we're going to see is, I'm starting it up. What's going on? It's getting cut off. I'm sorry. Let me try a different way. Drag it over. It's almost as bad as the live demo, right? Yeah, it's doing it there too. All right, is that big enough? Can you all see that? Drag it. There we go. Is that better? Yeah, sorry about that. All right. Okay, so running the console here. We've got a console. And we've got 2 peers that our console's aware of. They're both those big UID blobs. We're going to send a shell command to that guy. And it's actually going to route through the other guy first. So we're going to go to Dropbox, and then the other peer is going to pick it up from Dropbox and relay it through SMB file share, and then the reverse is going to happen to send the response. And I'll drag it. I'll try to drag it up. This is getting kind of low. So we got back we did a who am I, we got back user. Real exciting, right? So let's do something a little bit more interesting. We'll do a directory listing. We'll list C:\\. And there's about an 18-second round trip because we're pulling Dropbox every 9 seconds. Well, I guess the max would be 18 seconds depending on how the wind is. Line. So in a second we'll see we get back a directory listing. There we go. So it worked. That's good. Okay. And that was not a live demo, that was a video, but I appreciate the applause anyway. I mean, I had a hard enough time getting the video to work, so we can't even imagine what it would have been like otherwise. Cool. And I wanted to talk a little bit about operational concerns, things you got to think about if you, as a red teamer, are going to use these different third-party channels. In particular, each channel is going to have its own concerns, but there's also credential handling concerns that are more general. With each service that you're going to use, you know, like Dropbox, for instance, I wrote an implant that used a connection to Dropbox, so obviously I had to embed some type of credentials in that implant, and then once that implant gets reverse engineered, those credentials get discovered. You want to make sure that whatever credentials you give it are as sandboxed and as limited as possible, so that you limit what can happen once that burning occurs. Yeah. And then I really need to get back into this last part to make sure I have enough time. So talking about a little bit about increasing red team capabilities, how do we mature our detection and response in kind? We definitely want to start anything at a fundamental level. Adversarial threats, as I kind of alluded to earlier, will use the minimum capabilities necessary to achieve their goal, right? If all you need is a reverse shell, then why do some kind of fancy Dropbox stuff if the reverse shell will work? So it's important that we, on the defensive side, address less mature methods first. Make sure that we've got those fundamental things, and like I said, I'm not an expert on the blue side, but there's a lot of things that are more fundamental at the network and protocol layer that we need to look at and think about reducing our attack surface. That picture's still in there. I thought I took it out. Okay, but what I really want to talk about in the next 10 minutes or so is this application layer. And so as I've looked at tunneling, command and control, traffic through a bunch of different types of services, there's some commonalities that you see. So if we're trying to detect that abuse of applications, it's kind of dependent upon the specific application that you're looking at as to how you would detect abuse, because each service is very different. And we're talking now about something above the network layer and above the protocol layer. We're more like an application layer. So some of these can be very challenging be very challenging to discriminate between legitimate and malicious usage. And the tools that exist today that I'm aware of, the commonly deployed tools, don't have that granularity to look within the application to make determinations about whether this is a good use of Dropbox or a bad use of Dropbox. It may just be allow a Dropbox or block it. So how can we do a little bit better than that? And I want to go through 10 ways to detect abuse of using these services for command and control. These are general principles that should be kind of adapted to your specific needs. They're a mixture of specific artifacts you can look for in requests and more general application behaviors. And most of these will require that TLS inspection to look within your HTTP traffic, but that's something we kind of assumed. And these are not like a top 10 or even the best 10 or anything like that. It's just 10 things that have come up as I've been looking at doing this. The first one's probably the easiest, unused services. So when somebody says, we don't use that here, that's probably a red flag, right? So you got an organization, say you use everything AWS. You're all about AWS, all in. And you see something going to Google Cloud Platform one day. That's an easy way to throw a red flag, right? Maybe even, block all traffic to Google Cloud if you're not using it in the enterprise. But at least you should be able to detect it. That's an easy way to raise a red flag. I didn't really talk at all about endpoint type controls today, but this one's just too good to pass up. Looking at correlation between processes and traffic, you can see stuff like, LSAS.exe should never be connecting to weird third-party services, right? That's a given. And that might seem a little silly, and hopefully a sophisticated attacker would not be doing something like that. But the point is that attackers make mistakes, and so you need to be ready for when those mistakes happen and be able to catch that one thing and then start that investigation. Unique domain activity. So a lot of these services, like S3 for instance, have unique domain names associated with accounts or associated with particular buckets, for instance. So if you know that your environment uses these 10 S3 buckets for prod and for your dev environment, then you can easily whitelist those and alert on others that you see through DNS queries or through HTTP traffic. Unique URL path, URL parameters. So similarly, something like Amazon's SQS, simple query service. So those queue names show up in the URLs. If you know what specific queues that you use, then you can whitelist those and you can alert on ones that aren't on that whitelist. And these are just examples like SQS, but there's a lot of other services that have unique things in the URLs. There's a lot of other services that have unique domain names, like Slack. Every Slack workspace has its own unique subdomain off of Slack.com, and ShareFile does the same thing. So these are broad principles dependent upon what services you're looking at. Headers are another good place to look. User agent mismatches is a great place to look for differences. So certain applications use particular user agent headers, and attackers can know that as well, but it's a good place to look for potential abuse. And there are application-specific headers that you can look for as well, the presence or absence of which may indicate a legitimate application versus something that's trying to pose as a legitimate application. Authentication is a good place to look. These API keys, these OAuth tokens, like when I'm using Dropbox earlier, I've got a static API key that I use for all the implants, which is going to look a little bit different than actual use of Dropbox, where clients will all have unique API keys. So if you're seeing the same API key coming from 10 different workstations, then that's something that should arouse suspicion. And sometimes, even over time, like you've got those keys rotating. So if you see a static key, 1 hour, 2 hour, 5 hours, that hasn't been rotated, then that can be a good place to look as well, to raise a red flag. Behaviors, which APIs are being used, how they're being used. A lot of these services offer multiple APIs that can do some of the same things. So the ones that you decide to use in your application versus somebody else's can allow you to differentiate, and the order in which they're used. Timing, so many things roll back to a time factor. The transport I was using earlier was polling Dropbox every 9 seconds. It's kind of an odd number, intentionally. Other applications that use Dropbox will poll at different intervals, or they won't poll at all. They'll use some kind of push mechanism. So it's a good way to discriminate between things. And then, like I said earlier, the ordering can be unique as well. Payload patterns. So I am using base64 text or just raw random looking bytes, and I'm using file names that look like UUID values. So that's a pattern that you can look for that may be very different from the way that other applications use the same service. And in more complicated formats like JPEG or MP3, you should look in the metadata fields, because that's where I'm stuffing a lot of these messages within those fields. And 10, general behavior. So just one example here. This is kind of a catch-all, but so you got okay. You got a WebEx meeting scheduled for 2 p.m. on Fridays, right? You got this WebEx chat room or conference room, but then you look at your network and someone's sending WebEx chats to this room all throughout the week. So that might be something that should arouse suspicion, because you understand how the application is used in a broad sense, and this is a deviation from it. So with Dropbox in particular, we go back through the list of 10 things or so, and most of those things that I just mentioned are ways that we can build detections. Wait, there's more. So I was thinking about how to make this a little bit easier. How do we take these concepts and apply them to the real world for detection? I'm not an expert on detection, but I think unit testing may be a way to start looking at some of these things. So what I have also done is started working on a little tool that uses these transports to spoof command and control connections to various services, and then spit out a report that says, here's the times stamps when these things occurred, and here's the 10 things that you should be able to pull out of your logs. So that's a work in progress. Hopefully that'll be posted in the next week or two. We'll see. Looks like I got about 1 minute left, so I got time for maybe one question. Yeah. Sure. So the question was, have I run across any organizations that forced me to use more sophisticated techniques like this? And the answer is yes, sort of. It's actually I started on this path maybe 2 years ago when I was doing a test for an organization, and I could not get any of my HTTP connections for different command and control tools to get out of their network for various reasons. And I banged my head against the wall for a couple days, and what frustrated me the most was the fact that I was just able to log in to ShareFile and upload and download any kind of files throughout this time. So I started trying to figure out how I could use that to bypass. I don't know if they forced me because their controls were so great, or that I was just doing something wrong, but that's kind of how I got started. I don't see it, but I like to think about what the next thing is. Okay, and that's it. Thank you all so much.